All right, so here we go. This is the finishing up of chapter 22, 23. What chapter is this? It's the New Deal chapter. 23. All right, my bad. Okay, so we made it, a good amount through. All right, come on, here we go. We made it a good amount through, and we got to basically the New Deal. So what we're talking about here is the various programs that were created by FDR's administration in order to address the most pressing issues of the Great Depression. So we talked about how the economy crashed. We spent a lot of time talking about the 1920s and the kind of house of cards that the economy was in the 1920s. They tried to prolong kind of that industrial output that occurred during World War I, but weren't able to do so forever. They kind of kept it going for maybe another 7 or 8 years, and then kind of the natural economic decline, the natural market adjustment that should happen in 1920, 21 ended up happening in 1928, 1929, and then that was coupled with the stock market crash, which then led to the collapse of the American banking system. And that fundamentally is the problem, or the cause, the main cause of the Great Depression is the collapse of the banking system. And we saw all the statistics that came about that showcase kind of the depths of the economic disaster, with thousands of banks closing, hundreds of thousands of businesses going out of business, millions of people losing their jobs, and of course all of that bringing the economic kind of circular flow of the economy to a screeching halt. Because if people don't have jobs, they don't have money to spend. If people don't have money to spend, then businesses aren't making money, they're losing money. They go out of business, they lay people off, and we're off and running. We then talked about how what compounded the Great Depression was the fact that the governing philosophy at the time was that of a small government, pro business philosophy. The conservative Republicans, which came into office with Warren G. Harding in 1921 and went from Harding to Coolidge, and then now is in the hands of Herbert Hoover in 1929 when the stock market crashes. This governing philosophy held by Herbert Hoover, this idea that the government's job is to stay, neutral, stay uninvolved, stay back, keep their hands off the economy, as we talked about, is a perfectly reasonable and respectable governing philosophy in normal times. But when the house is on fire, we need someone to take action. So the analogy I gave before, which I'll repeat, is if you are a water conservationist and your entire focus is try to make sure that your household uses the least amount of water as possible. Well, when the house is burning down, you kind of have to give up on your water conservation principles and use as much water as you need to be able to put the fire out. So if your political philosophy is a conservative political philosophy that we should reduce the amount of government and let the economy exist, that's fine, except that when there's a global economic downturn, one that is completely melting the entire economy and turning it upside down, you kind of have to, throw your principles aside for a second and do what's needed at the time in order to stave off a disaster. Herbert Hoover refuses to do that at first. He eventually will, but his refusal to do that is going to make the Great Depression even worse. So by the time we get to the election of 1932, Herbert Hoover is going to get absolutely walloped in what is, at that point, the greatest electoral college defeat in American history. And remember, in 1928, Herbert Hoover won the single greatest electoral college victory in American history up to that point. So the fact that he went from the biggest electoral college victory to the biggest electoral college loss shows you how dispirited and frustrated people were with his reaction to the Great Depression, which was abysmal. His opponent, dude named Franklin Delano Roosevelt, second cousin of Teddy Roosevelt, ran for president, basically saying we need to do something about the Great Depression. Very vague, but saying we need to do something about the Great Depression. And generally speaking, the people like that idea. They like the idea of doing something. So you see Franklin Delano Roosevelt enter the White, and like I said, he won a monumental landslide victory. There it is. He won the blue states. It's a pretty big one. And then in 1936, he'll win an even bigger one, but we'll get to that later on. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR, as we'll call him from here on out, basically comes in the same kind of style as his cousin, Teddy Roosevelt, where Teddy Roosevelt came in following a series of presidents whose general philosophy was to kind of stay uninvolved, that the government shouldn't do anything, right? The forgotten presidents of the 1890s. And then Teddy came in and completely shifted the entire focus of the federal government. Well, now FDR is going to come in and do something quite similar. He's going to come in following the 1920s, 3 consecutive pro-business presidents, and he's going to completely shift the entire perspective of the federal government again, in the same way that his cousin did. So he comes in. Remember, Teddy Roosevelt came in and said the American people deserve a fair deal. FDR is going to come in and say the American people deserve a new deal. So the New Deal is the term that we give to just an avalanche of new government programs that are meant to try to address the Great Depression. It's, how do I want to say it? It's, as I said before, there was no real strong specific strategy of how to handle the Great Depression when FDR ran for president. And then we got into the White House. His whole philosophy was, let's just invite as many smart people as we can to come and give us ideas. And we'll try everything that people suggest, and things that work we'll keep, and things that don't we won't. It was just this huge experimentation, right? So again, back to the analogy of the house being on fire. The house is burning down, and no one's ever seen a house on fire before. They're just trying whatever they can, right? So let's throw balls of newspaper at it. Okay, no, that makes the fire bigger. Let's all sing and hope that makes the fire go away. Okay, that's making no difference. What if we throw a bucket of water on it? Oh, that's working. More buckets of water, right? So that's kind of the same way they're addressing the Great Depression. It's just, let's try a variety of programs, and things that make it worse, we'll stop doing. Things that are kind of neutral, then we'll kind of stop doing, or maybe make adjustments to. And things that are working, will expand, right? So FDR comes in and, like I said, presents the New Deal, which is not one specific program. It's dozens and dozens of programs that address a variety of different issues. And one of the big things that FDR was focusing on was trying to make sure he was communicating with the American people. Because Herbert Hoover did a really bad job of that. And his big concern was, if there's panic, if there's fear, then that's kind of going to be our biggest barrier to actually getting out of this thing. So we really wanted to calm people down and show people that the government was actually doing stuff. So we'd have weekly fireside chats, which were radio addresses, in which you would just kind of calmly talk through all the things the government was doing to try to address the Great Depression, telling people what the new programs were, which ones were working, which ones weren't working, et cetera, et cetera. As he said in his inaugural address, one of the most famous lines in American history, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. So communicating with the American people is a huge part of FDR's plan, and also is going to make him wildly popular. It had never been before that a majority of Americans even heard the president's voice, right? Like, radio is a new medium, and the fact that most Americans have one in their home is a brand new thing. And the fact that he's going on the radio once a week and talking to people, most people never knew what the president sounded like. People that lived in the age of Abraham Lincoln didn't know what his voice sounded like or what he looked like, unless there was like a picture in the newspaper or something. But that was even probably a sketch. So the point being, FDR really connects to the American people and becomes wildly popular as a result. But what really matters are the programs, because if you got on the radio and talked all day long, but none of the programs worked, then I'm sure he wouldn't stay popular very long. So as I said, there's just a whole avalanche of programs that are going to be tossed out there, and we're going to talk about kind of a bunch of them, although we won't talk about a vast majority because there were so many, but we'll talk about some of the highlights. And even though there's a whole bunch of different programs that are meant to address a whole bunch of different issues, basically there's kind of 3 different strategies or ways to look at this that we call the 3 R's of the New Deal: relief, recovery, and reform. That some of these programs are designed to give direct relief to people who are directly in harm's way, right? People who are about to lose their job, people who are about to lose their home, people who are about to lose all their money in the bank, or they've already lost their job, or they've already lost their home, and they've already lost all the money in the bank. People who are distressed, people who are directly in harm's way. So we need to create some programs to directly assist those people, right? Then there are recovery programs. The recovery programs are focused on digging us out of the Great Depression. Like, let's get out of this crisis. Let's move on, right? Let's get out of this thing. Let's try to build ourselves back to an economy that's growing, that's being productive. So there's a whole bunch of recovery programs that are focused on that, right? Relief programs help people who are directly in harm's way right now, immediately. Recovery programs, how are we going to get our economy kind of turned around and moving in a positive direction again. And the reform is thinking about long term, right? Like, what are the things that caused the Great Depression, and what can we do as a society or as a government? How can we adjust kind of our economy in certain ways to make sure that never happens again? What kinds of regulations can we put in? What kind of rules can we put in? What kind of practices can we change to make sure that the things that led to the Great Depression never happen again? Because remember, the Great Depression is a self-inflicted wound, right? It's a man-made disaster. It's not, oh my God, there's a huge pandemic or something like that caused this to all go astray. It is something we did to ourselves. So if we can learn what we did wrong and then change that stuff, we can make sure something like this never happens again. Those are reform programs. So there are relief programs, recovery programs, reform programs. And again, let's go back to the analogy, there's a house on fire. If a house is on fire, the first thing you need to do is get people in the house out of the house. Get them out of the house. Get people who are directly in harm's way out of harm's way. So that is relief programs, right? People who are directly in harm's way, get them out of harm's way. The next thing you need to do if there's a house on fire after you've gotten people out of the house is put the fire out, right? Get out the fire hoses, put that fire out, get out of the crisis, move forward, like get the crisis handled, right? So that's what the recovery programs are. Like, let's get out of the Great Depression, let's get out of the fire, let's get this done. And the reform would be, now that we've got people out of the house, now that we've put the fire out, let's think about how we can rebuild this house in a way where it's less flammable, or how we can rebuild this house in a way that's less likely to catch on fire and burn down. How can we rebuild our economy in a way where we can avoid this disaster again, this Great Depression? So we're going to talk about a bunch of programs, and also some of the programs will qualify as multiple of these topics. Some of them will be relief and recovery. Sometimes some of them will be recovery and reform. But those are kind of the three main goals of what we're focusing on during the New Deal to try to address the Great Depression. All right, so the very first issue that we need to focus on is banking reform, right? Because that's fundamentally it. This is the cause of the Great Depression. If someone were to say in an oversimplified way in 6 words what caused the Great Depression, you would say the collapse of the banking system. So the first thing we need to address is the banking system. This problem is immense. In just the few months before FDR took office, 4,000 banks are going to close. 4,000 banks in the months before he took office. Now, all of those banks close. That money's not insured. That money's not protected. Everybody who has money in those banks, any business who has money in those banks, everybody who did the smart thing and put their money in a bank to keep it safe, that money's gone, right? Just gone, dust in the wind. And so this is a huge catastrophe. Again, this is the fundamental cause of the Great Depression. So the very first thing that they do when they get in office, that FDR and his team do, his administration, is declare an emergency banking act, a national banking holiday. Basically says we're going to hit the pause button on everything. We're going to freeze. Okay, banks cannot loan out money. Banks cannot take deposits. No one can get their money out of the bank. No one can deposit money in the bank. It's just a huge freeze, right? And that allows the government to go in and inspect all of the banks to see how much cash they actually have on hand. Like, what do their reserves look like? And if they actually have enough cash to continue operating and doing business, then they let them reopen. Those who don't have enough to do that, they might combine them with other banks, right? Or they might let them go out of business, but do it in a way where it was with some protection from the government. The point being, if, again, I'm not going to let go of this analogy, if the house is on fire and there's a bunch of people in the house and you have to figure out what's the best strategy to get out of the house, what's the best strategy to make sure that, we can get people out safely and maybe put the fire or whatever, how nice would it be if you could hit a pause button and everything just stopped? You could spend an hour just walking around the house, looking at where the fire is, where it's going, where everybody is, what the escape routes are, and then go back and hit play, and then boom, 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 you can save everybody, get them out of the house. That's essentially what the Emergency Banking Act is. It's just to freeze everything, hit pause on the banks. And it worked. The statistics show it worked. In 1934, the year after the Emergency Banking Act was put in, only 61 banks will close. So are we back as a booming economy where everything's growing and there's a massive amount of wealth being created? No, definitely not. We still have 61 banks that close. That's not good. But 61 banks closing in 1 year is far better than thousands of banks closing in just a few months before someone takes office. So the Emergency Banking Act is one program. Now, this you could say is both relief and recovery, right? Because it's giving relief to people who may be losing, if a bank goes out of business, will lose their life savings, but it's also recovery because by just calming down this banking crisis allows us to start to turn the economy around and maybe start to build back. So that qualifies as both relief and recovery. The Glass-Steagall Act is another one focused on banking. The first thing it does, it creates the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or the FDIC. What the FDIC does is it insures people's money in banks. So if you have your money in a bank and a bank goes out of business, the government has that money insured up to a certain amount. So one of the big problems with the Great Depression is when thousands of banks were going out, going under, going out of business, people who had their money in those banks lost all the money, gone, right? Never going to get it back. Well, after the Glass-Steagall Act created the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the federal government said, we will insure your money up to $2,500. Then, now it's $250,000. So if you have money in the bank, like if I have money in the bank and that bank goes out of business, the federal government will back up that money and give me the money I had in the bank up to 250,000. And I don't have more than 250,000 in case you were curious. So I would get all my money back, right? So that's a huge, huge, huge focus on reform, right? This is a big reform piece. This is okay. Well, one of the biggest things that caused the Great Depression. Okay, the fact that when the banks went out of business, everybody lost all their money. That's bad. Let's change that for the future. Let's make sure that that doesn't happen again in the future. So if something like this happens again, at least everybody's money will be backed up and people won't lose their life savings, et cetera, et cetera. So the FDIC is definitely when it comes to relief, recovery, and reform, it's definitely a reform program. Another piece of the Glass-Steagall Act, which is part of reform, which is huge, it's the key part of reform, is basically creating kind of a firewall between deposit banks and investment banks, right? So one of the big problems of the Great Depression is a whole bunch of people put their money in the bank, and the banks took those money and loaned it out to people who wanted to invest in the stock market, right? Bad loans, risky loans, not a good idea. So now the government says you can't do both of those things. You could either be a deposit bank where people deposit their money, or you could be an investment bank, right? You can't be both. So if somebody wants to have their money invested, they can go to an investment bank and say, invest my money, go. And if you lose all your money, that's your bad because you chose to do that. But if you're just, Joey Baloney who wants to invest his money in the bank and keep it safe, we want to make sure that you can be confident that that money is not going to be then lent out in some kind of crazy scheme. So it creates a firewall in between. You could be a deposit bank or you can be an investment bank. We don't want banks taking people's money and loaning them out. This is huge, right? That was essentially a fundamental key linchpin in the entire thing with the collapse of the economic system. So we want to make sure that does not happen again. So this is not relief, not recovery, but reform, thinking about the future and making sure this doesn't happen. And if you want to evidence that it worked, we will not see another financial crisis of this nature in the United States until 2008. And what happened with 2008 was in 1998, there was a Democratic president, Bill Clinton, and a Republican Congress. So both parties are at fault here, who decided to kind of gut that part of the Glass-Steagall Act. They decided to pull back on some of those regulations. In other words, kind of easing up on letting banks loan out money in a risky way. So it worked between the 1930s and the 1990s. It worked for 60 years. And then in 1998, they revoked it. 10 years later, we had another economic crisis that was basically caused, it's a little bit different, but basically caused by that same type of behavior. So the Glass-Steagall Act worked. When they got rid of it, bad things happened again, right? Now, they still haven't put anything like the Glass-Steagall Act back in. Not enough elected officials are talking about that. Some talk about it, but not enough are. So anyway, banking reform, it is successful. First, we see a relief and recovery when it comes to the Emergency Banking Act. Then we see reform when it comes to the Glass-Steagall Act in multiple ways. The FDIC, by the way, if you go on any bank's website today and just click around and scroll to the bottom, you will see it's an FDIC insured bank. You can't exist as a bank without being FDIC insured. So that's a reform. And then also the Glass-Steagall Act creating that firewall, which no longer exists, but that firewall between the deposit banks and investment banks. All right. The next areas that the New Deal are going to focus on, the New Deal programs are going to focus on, are agriculture and manufacturing. So remember, one of the main issues we have with the American economy during this time period is that our kind of supply and demand are all wibble wobble, right? It's not a key term. Don't put that in your SAQ. That, at least we know with manufacturing, with industrial goods, we had all these problems where after World War I, demand's going to fall down here, but we don't want to decrease supply. So we should convince people through kind of consumerism and advertising that they should buy a bunch of consumer goods, and that created artificial demand to match supply, but that wasn't going to last forever. And then eventually people go into debt and they stop spending money. So now supply is much higher than demand. Prices get all out of shape. So we talked about all that stuff. And that's a problem, right? The fact that supply and demand are not matching up, both in the agricultural sector, which we haven't talked about that much, but also in the industrial sector. And all of this is caused by World War I, because we had this huge spike in production during World War I. And then when that demand dropped, that's going to create an inequality between supply and demand. It's going to get us away from equilibrium, and that's going to create instability, right? So that's the problem. So you can see farms are overproducing. They're making too much food, right? They're making too much stuff. And that means prices will fall. That's a bad thing, right? Then we also saw overproduction of industrial, which then collapsed. And now we actually see underproduction of industrial, right? So either way, the point being is supply and demand for agricultural goods and industrial goods are not matching. And that's what we want. We want a matching supply and demand. We want stability. So a couple new programs that come out under FDR's New Deal. And by the way, I should have said this at the beginning, so my apologies for this. The New Deal is, all these programs come out in the first 100 days of his presidency, right? All these come out between like March, April, and May. So it's just the first 100 days, just like an insane amount of action, just a dizzying amount of action, just programs. So those banking programs that come out, these programs we're about to talk about on this slide and all the subsequent slides, all that stuff comes out in the first 100 days of his presidency. So it's a ton of programs just being rolled out, and we're only doing the tip of the iceberg here. All right. So the Agricultural Adjustment Act is created to try to deal with this issue of farms overproducing, right? We have overproduction in farms, which means prices fall. So the farmers have this problem where they're growing too much food. And if they cut back on the amount of food they grow, then they won't make enough of a profit to cover their costs. So they'll lose money. But if they don't, they and all the other farmers have overproduced, which means prices fall, which means the profit they will get won't be enough to cover their costs. So either way, if they're stuck between a rock and a hard place, they're not going to be able to cover their costs. They either have to reduce how much they make, and all farmers would have to do that together collectively, which would be hard to organize. Or because if you reduce the amount that you make, then prices will go back up. That's good. Or you just sell everything you've grown and prices are low and you can't cover it. So what the federal government does through the Agricultural Adjustment Act is they pay farmers to grow less stuff. They say, look, we know that you need to make this much profit to cover your costs, but we need you to make this much stuff. So we'll pay for you to just stop growing this, or to destroy this stuff, to toss this stuff out, or to let it rot. Like, we'll pay you to just either not grow food or not sell it, not send it to market. Like, we'll basically buy that food from you. It'll be destroyed, whatever. Which seems crazy, especially at a time when people are losing their jobs and starving and so on and so forth. But it's about creating stability in the agricultural sector. Otherwise, the whole economy is going to continue to teeter-totter and things will not be good. So this is called government subsidies. The government is paying these farmers to not grow food, right? It's paying them to reduce the amount of production they have. So that's the Agricultural Adjustment Act, right? So that's a pretty significant government program. Then in order to try to focus on the industrial sector, they create something called the National Recovery Act, or the NRA, which is a different NRA than the one we're most familiar with, which is all about guns and stuff. But the National Recovery Act, or the NRA, is going to, and pay attention to what this actually sounds like, is going to encourage businesses to establish self-governing private associations to agree on set prices and production quotas. So they're encouraging businesses to establish self-governing private associations to agree on set prices and production quotas. So if you think about it, that's basically a trust, right? So now the government, which under Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson was telling everybody, oh, you gotta break up trust, trusts are bad. Now they're encouraging businesses to create trust. Now, not in the exact same way. The whole point here is if businesses come together and say, we're gonna have an agreed upon production quota, so we're making too much, we're making too little, we're making too much, we're making too little. Well, those guys are making more, so we need to make less, and we need to make more. It's trying to kind of eliminate, or at least reduce, competition between the companies that make the same goods, so that we can get some stability in the economy. So let's have an agreed upon set price for what we're selling Widgemoos for. Let's have an agreed upon total of Widgemoos that we're going to create and who's going to create what. So we're encouraging all the different Widgemoo producers to come together, with the government, under the watchful eye of the government, to make sure that we don't fall back into like true actual trust like we saw in the 1880s and 1890s. But we're encouraging them to come together under strict government regulation and oversight in order to try to like level this whole thing out. So that's what the National Recovery Administration does, or the NRA. Another huge issue that needs to be looked at is unemployment, right? We talked about how unemployment is going to reach 25% at the worst point in the Great Depression, and some cities will be as high as 80%. People don't have jobs, they don't get paid. People don't get paid, they don't spend money. People don't spend money, and the businesses go out of business, and then more people lose their jobs. It's a terrible situation. We already saw Herbert Hoover, despite his original lack of interest to do anything, actually employ a pretty successful strategy. And it's the same strategy that Jacob Coxey had advocated for all the way back in the economic crisis of 1893, which is that the government should invest a bunch of money in infrastructure projects so that they can put people to work. All these unemployed people can go and repair roads and repair bridges and repair dams and repair levees. How do I know it's levees or levees? Anyway, repair old schools, repair old libraries, repair old post office, government buildings, right? Or build new ones, build new roads, build new highways, build new bridges, build new levees, build new dams, build new schools, build new post offices, build new libraries. All these things, all these programs that either need to be revamped or built originally. Let's have the government spend money and get to work doing it. So Hoover, as we talked about, actually started doing that. He invested $700 million in such programs. And the New Deal is only going to just embellish that, make that even larger, right? So they're going to create programs like the Public Works Administration, the Civil Works Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and more as we move forward. And all of these are government-funded construction projects. The PWA and the CWA will put 4 million Americans to work doing exactly what I was just talking about, repairing bridges, building roads, building government buildings, et cetera, et cetera. The Civilian Conservation Corps is the same idea, but it's basically in the woods, to go and kind of clear the forest, to make sure we can avoid forest fires, to go and build kind of fire roads, build picnic benches in state parks. You go to Mount Diablo State Park, and you sit at a picnic bench. Half the picnic benches up on Mount Diablo were built by the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s. Now you might be thinking, well, why? For all of the things that are going on, people starving, people losing their jobs, people losing their homes, we're building picnic benches? That's crazy. It's not about the picnic benches. It's about paying people to do work. I mean, you could have just paid people to dig a big old hole on Monday and come back on Tuesday and fill it back in. It doesn't really matter. We just need to get people working and paid. But if you can also improve roads and bridges and public buildings and so on and so forth, while you're doing that, why not? It's a win-win, right? So employing millions of Americans to go to work, then all those Americans have money in their pocket and they can spend money. None of this was supposed to be permanent government jobs, right? It was supposed to be temporary. All the infrastructure projects, once they're done, but hopefully by the time you've done that and put money in people's pocket, they spent that money, that's going to bring businesses back, and then businesses will start hiring again, right? So the whole idea is just when businesses take a huge dip, the government can step in and hire a bunch of people, keep that circular flow going, and then once the businesses come back, then all those people who got government jobs can now go back to the private industry. But another piece of that is that also there's a lot of thought about dignity, right? About how people want to have a sense of dignity by having a job and getting paid, right? That it wasn't just about, let's just send people checks, right? Let's just send people money so they could spend it, which would have also had the same effect. Like, let's just send people money, they can spend it, and the economy will keep on humming. But no, we want to give people dignity. So look at the posters that they use to advertise these programs. None of them are about people having money in their pockets. None of them are about people, what they'd be able to buy and spend. It says work promotes confidence, right? The Civilian Conservation Corps, young man's opportunity for work, play, study, and health. And look how proud or happy those people are to have a job and go to work, right? So these programs are about not only about putting money in people's pockets so they could spend and making sure that people have jobs and are employed, but giving them a sense of dignity by going to work, right? So we're looking at banking. We're looking at agriculture and manufacturing. So we're looking at the banking industry, which is the biggest thing. We need to get that stabilized. We need to get our kind of production, supply and demand wibble wobble stabilized into a stable. I just said stabilize into a stable, but stabilized into a consistent and predictable economic kind of situation. And we need to get people back to work. So all of these programs, the Emergency Banking Act, the Glass-Steagall Act, the AAA, the NRA, the PWA, the CWA, the CCC, all these programs, which, by the way, jokingly, people will start calling all these programs alphabet soup because they'll have acronyms. You can't keep track of what's what. But all these programs in the first 100 days of the administration look a lot different than what it did under Hoover, and are going to start to actually see some impact. We're going to actually start to see these things have some payoff. The next issue that we need to focus on is the housing crisis, right? Tons of people, I was going to say millions, but it may even end up in the millions, but hundreds of thousands of Americans are losing their homes. You don't have a job, you can't pay your rent. You don't have a job, you can't pay your mortgage, you're going to lose your home. This is why homeless encampments are popping up in cities all over the United States. The Hoovervilles, as we talked about, right? Between 1930 and 1932, 500,000 Americans are going to lose their homes. This is a really bad situation. And the big problem here is, of course, if you don't have a job, you can't pay, right? But a lot of people even get to keep their jobs, see their salaries drop or their hours drop or whatever. And one of the big problems is, most people can't buy a home just straight out of their pocket. So you take a loan from a bank, and now you're paying the bank back. And maybe the interest rate is 21%, which is a really high interest rate, or 24%, which is even higher. And you could afford that before everything crashed, but now paying the actual principal on the loan plus the interest rate, that just adds up to being a lot, and you can't afford it. So what the government's going to do is they're going to create something called the Homeowners Loan Corporation, the HOLC, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which will allow homeowners to refinance their loans in this way. The government will give you a loan. So let's say you owe, First National Bank $7,000 for your home. It's a lot of money back then. And you have to pay them a certain amount a month plus interest. Oh, God, we can't keep up with that. Well, the government's going to say, how about we give you a loan for $7,000? Take that $7,000 and you pay First National Bank. Now you're done with them. You don't owe them any more money. But you owe the government $7,000. So how is that better? Well, if the interest rate you were paying to First National Bank was like 18% or 20% or 22%, now the interest rate to the federal government is going to be 2% or 3%. So you owe $7,000 both ways, but your monthly payments are going to be much lower back to the federal government because they're not going to charge you that huge interest rate, right? So this is an opportunity to allow people to stay in their homes, and we're going to see a ton of people take advantage of this, and a ton of people stay in their home because they can actually be able to afford and cover the mortgage or the rent or whatever. Well, it wouldn't be rent, to cover the mortgage, given that lower interest rate, right? So this is going to be a relief program. I kind of got away with saying which ones are relief and recovery, but you could probably figure it out on some of the other ones. This is going to be a relief program, right? These are people who are directly in harm's way, about to lose their home, and we're going to make sure they don't by allowing them to refinance their interest rate. It's also going to be a reform program because that program is going to become permanent. The Federal Housing Act of 1934 makes the HOLC a permanent program. So if you are low income, if you fall below a certain kind of a line of what your wealth and income is, you can apply for one of these federal housing loans, and you get a super low interest rate, much lower than anything any of the banks will give you. But you have to, again, be pretty low on the socioeconomic scale in order to do that. But that is going to be a long-term program, right? That's going to be a reform. It's going to be a way to make sure that people can stay in their homes, because if people don't and they fall into homelessness, this is a bad situation, not just for them, but for society in general. So the Homeowners Loan Corporation is a relief program helping people directly in harm's way, which also then many of the relief programs too will also be a recovery program, because if people are staying in their homes, that allows those people to continue to maybe have a little bit more money to spend in other places, and helps us get out of the depression. But also reform, because the Federal Housing Act of 1934 will be made permanent. I'll go back real quick. These are absolutely relief programs. I mean, it's called unemployment relief. Of course, it's about getting people to work, people who are directly in harm's way, people who are out of work, getting them back to work. But as I said a moment ago, pretty much all relief programs are also recovery programs, because as these people get back to work, it's good for them, but also good for getting us out of the economic kind of muck, because as they get jobs, they get paid, they spend that money, and we can start to get that circular flow going again. So these are definitely relief programs, but could also be qualified as recovery programs. These are definitely recovery programs, right? Like National Recovery Administration. These are all about getting our economy, which is all wibble wabble, back in order, right? Sorry, I went back a couple of slides just because to make sure everything's clear on relief, recovery, and reform. Okay, so the next issue that needs to be addressed is Wall Street, because remember, Wall Street's kind of the scoundrel that started this whole thing. It was crazy speculative buying of stocks on the stock market that caused the stock prices to skyrocket. This whole new kind of just havoc and chaos that happened on the stock market that caused this huge spike and then this huge collapse. All of that was all bad. So the federal government's going to create something called the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is a government oversight commission, which job it is to basically keep an eye on Wall Street, to make sure that nothing crazy is going on there. Something kind of nutty is going on, they kind of step in and say, okay, what's going on? Investigate, try to get things kind of back focused again, to make sure, again, that we don't have this crazy like spike and drop that happened basically overnight and ended up, again, pulling the linchpin out from underneath the banking system and causing the entire economic collapse. So, you know, the whole GameStop thing that happened a month ago or whatever, certainly the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, is going to look into that. Now, the reality is over time, the SEC is basically going to become feckless in the same way that we saw in the 1890s, like the commissions and stuff that were supposed to regulate railroads were basically just populated by people who worked for the railroads and didn't actually do anything. That's kind of true about the SEC at this point. They don't really do that good of a job regulating because they've kind of been corrupted by the people on Wall Street. But back in the 1930s and for quite some time, that was their job and they did do it effectively. Let's make sure that we don't see some wild stuff going down on Wall Street that's going to destabilize the entire economy. So this obviously is reform, relief, recovery, reform. Reform is about figuring out what got us here and then making sure we address that. So one of the things that got us here is craziness on Wall Street. How do we address that? We create a Wall Street Oversight Commission in the federal government, right? So there you go. Just an absolute, again, that's probably like 8 or 9 programs. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of other programs that we won't talk about in the lecture, even more that aren't even talked about in the textbook, some of which that were tried and failed. But these are some of kind of the biggest, most impactful programs. Again, some of them are relief, about helping people directly in harm's way. Some of them are about recovery, helping us dig ourselves out of the Great Depression. And some of them are about reform, helping us make sure that something like that never happens again. All right. The New Deal is going to be widely popular among the American people. Again, we will see FDR get reelected by the largest electoral college margin ever in American history, ever before and ever since in 1936. But that doesn't mean there aren't critics. Of course, there is criticism. So he's going to be criticized from people who are conservative, right? Like there's a lot of people who supported the kind of conservative, small government, don't get involved, all that other deal. So he's going to get criticized from the far right. Organizations like the Liberty League, which is a far-right organization, the National Association of Manufacturers, a lot of people are going to call the New Deal a socialist program, too much government involvement. As you can see here, the New Deal was a socialist program that included reckless spending which supported tyranny. The government's taking over too much power. The government's spending too much money. This is basically socialism. So these are the accusations that are being made by a small group of very conservative people. Now, if FDR had come into office during normal times and proposed all the things he was proposing, probably be a much larger percentage of the population who would have been uncomfortable with it, right? But the reality, again, as we said before, is that because everything is so dire, because the situation is so cataclysmic, a whole bunch of Americans who may have been uncomfortable with it in normal times are like, yeah, dude, like go for it. Like we need whatever you can do, right? But the real problem for FDR is going to be that the Supreme Court is actually quite conservative. And there's going to be quite a few New Deal programs, some of which we talked about, some of which we didn't, that are going to be struck down by the Supreme Court, saying that's unconstitutional. We talked about the National Recovery Act. Here it says the National Industrial Recovery Act, but it's the same thing. The National Recovery Act, they're going to say is unconstitutional, or at least parts of it are. The Agricultural Adjustment Act. So those are the two pieces right there that were the ones that were most focused on recovery, that are most focused on trying to get our economic system back into equilibrium. And it makes sense that that would be the one that would be the most easy to target, because this is the government taking huge steps into controlling pieces of the economy, which is something that you don't do in a free market system. Even if you're super liberal for the most part, you don't do that level of stuff. Now, the justification again is this is a crisis. We got to do what we got to do, right? Like during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln like suspended habeas corpus and violated the Constitution in a variety of ways. we had a civil war going on. During the Great Depression, FDR is going to do some stuff that wouldn't normally fit in with kind of the economic principles of a free market system as the United States is, but the entire economy is burning up and melting down. So we got to do these things. But the Supreme Court didn't agree, and they struck it down. A couple of other ones like the Railroad Retirement Act and the Fraser-Lemke Act, which we didn't talk about, which you don't really know the details of, but just to let you know that there are a variety of pieces of the New Deal that a conservative Supreme Court was like, nah, bro, like, you can't do that. So criticism from the right, criticism from conservatives about the New Deal, many people saying, well, this is socialism, you can't do that, blah, blah, blah. But there's also going to be criticism from the left saying that he's not going far enough. Now, let me just pause there and say, generally speaking, if you have people on one side of you saying you're not doing enough, people on the other side of you saying you're doing too much, that probably tells you you're doing the right amount, right? If you people on both extremes are, telling you both ways. If everybody's saying you're not doing enough, you probably need to do more. If everybody's saying you're doing too much, you need to do less. But if you have people on both sides saying you're doing too much, you're not doing enough, probably in the right place, which explains why FDR is going to win 4 consecutive presidential elections, because most Americans will think you're doing it just right. You got the Goldilocks effect going on here, right? But let's see what some of these people on the left are complaining about. So there's a businessman who became popular during this time named Francis Townsend, who proposed something called the Old Age Revolving Pension Plan, in which he said we need to give a certain amount of money, in this case is $200 a month, to people who are retired and over 60 years old. Just give them money. So remember when I was talking about those recovery programs, people can go work for the Public Works Administration or go work for the CCC. There's this argument like we don't want to just send people checks, right? We don't want to just have people say, give me a check, I'm depending on the government, give them a sense of dignity in their work. Well, the argument here is, well, if somebody is of retirement age, they don't really qualify for that. We're not going to send a bunch of 70-year-olds out to like cut down trees, or a bunch of 70-year-olds out to like rebuild bridges. So maybe we need to just give these people straight up money. And oftentimes people who are retired are the people who are most impacted, because people's retirement money, which they're not working anymore, they can't make any more money, they're just counting on that to live out the rest of their lives, was in the stock market and got wiped out. So the argument here was to create something where we're just going to give $200 a month. This is the argument made by Francis Townsend, give $200 a month to people who are retired and over 60 years old. So that's, you need to do more. Here's an idea. Huey Long, who was a senator from Louisiana, created the Share Our Wealth Society. Now, it's hard to imagine a senator from Louisiana being to the left of FDR, because nowadays Louisiana is obviously probably don't have any Democrats living there. But anyway, the Share Our Wealth Society. He wanted to dramatically increase taxes on the rich and then redistribute that wealth to everybody else. So one of the big questions of the Great Depression and the New Deal is, well, wait a minute, when the stock market crashes, that money doesn't just disappear. Money doesn't just disappear. It's got to be somewhere, right? Yeah, it's in the hands of the rich. Like, the Great Depression doesn't hurt rich people. In fact, it actually benefits a lot of rich people. When the stock market crashed, most of the money that quote unquote disappeared, it didn't really disappear. The value of stocks dropped. But people who spent money on stocks, right, and then later on the value had dropped, people who knew what they were doing knew when to sell, right? And a lot of the stuff that happens as far as, loans and all the kind of different aspects of things that we don't really need to get into, the point being that a lot of what happens in the Great Depression is a lot of the wealth, again, kind of goes to the very top. And those people don't spend as much money, right, as regular everyday people. They just kind of hold on to it to a certain degree. And so his whole thing, as we saw going all the way back to 1892 with the populace, is we need to have not just an income tax, but a very aggressive income tax, in which a very aggressive, progressive income tax, in which the people who are rich are taxed a lot, and you use that money to be able to help people who are struggling to get by. Then there was a popular radio personality and priest named Father Charles Coughlin, who created the National Union for Social Justice. And he wanted FDR to nationalize the banks. In the same way that we've heard arguments that the government should nationalize the railroads. And we talked about this before, in the same way that the government, schools are nationalized, right? Post office is nationalized, highways are nationalized, the military is nationalized. These are all things that are controlled by the government. Maybe I shouldn't say nationalized, but there's a ton of things that we have in our society today that aren't businesses, right? Schools and police and fire and roads and post office and military and et cetera, et cetera. So there are arguments throughout American history that different industries should be taken over by the government because they are too important for the public good to be trusted to businesses. So we saw a lot of that talk about railroads in the 1880s and 1890s. We see a lot of that talk today about the healthcare system, right? It's one of the big political arguments today. Should the healthcare system be kind of allowed to remain privatized, or should we have a public healthcare system, right? So the argument during this time period from Father Charles Coughlin was that FDR should nationalize the banks, that the government should take over banks. There should not be private industries. It should also be noted, not that it's relative to this lecture at all, but just because we're talking about him, Father Charles Coughlin was a aggressive, violent, vile anti-Semitic leader as well. So he didn't just talk about we need to do more in the Great Depression. He was also incredibly anti-Semitic. So just in case anybody was thinking about holding him up as some sort of a hero, not so much. But anyway, so there are people who want him to do more, FDR to do more. And there are people who think he's doing too much. Again, that kind of tells you you're probably going about it just about right. But the biggest concern for FDR is those pieces of legislation that were struck down by the Supreme Court, because that's real. That's something you actually have to deal with, right? You have to say, well, wait a minute, now we have to kind of figure out how we can readjust those. So that brings us to part 3, which won't be that long. It's called the Second New Deal and the Redefining of Liberalism. So the first New Deal was the first 100 days, right? The first New Deal was like, all right, here's all the new programs. We're going to do this. We're going to do this. We're going to, we're going to fix the banking system. We're going to get the industrial and agricultural sectors of the economy kind of more evened out and calmed down, so the economy will be more stable and not all wibble wabble all over the place. We're going to get people back to work. We're going to give people jobs. We're going to make sure people can stay in their homes because people are losing their homes, and we've got to get some control over Wall Street. So we're going to do all that stuff in the first 100 days, plus a whole bunch of other stuff we didn't even talk about. So the first New Deal is the first 100 days. Then the second New Deal is basically the rest of his first term, right? Or his first couple of terms. So we're going to continue, he's going to continue to work towards expanding the New Deal, creating more programs, but it's going to go about in a more kind of like, not as rapid fire, not as kind of like helter skelter, not as like, oh my God, we're in the middle of an emergency. Like at this point that we've kind of got the whole economy stabilized to a degree, and we have to figure out how to keep it stabilized, keep it from dropping again, and maybe kind of get it growing back. So now we're looking at over like a few years period here, how can we really get this thing continue the New Deal? How can we grow on what we've already done? So the second New Deal is a little bit slower, a little bit more methodical, a little bit more strategic, and not just kind of helter skelter. Oh my God, what's going on? Let's try to do anything we can to fix this thing. All right. So as I mentioned just a moment ago, FDR is going to get criticism from the right and criticism from the left. He is going to respond by moving farther to the left. He's not going to hear his conservative critics and be like, you know what, they might be right. Maybe I should try to be a little bit less. Maybe I should tone it down a little bit. He heard from his liberal kind of progressive critics, and he's like, you're right, let's take it even farther, right? So you see here the political cartoon. He's going back to Congress and being like, give me some more. Like, let's keep going. Let's keep going with this thing. 2 key pieces of legislation that come from the Second New Deal that showcase this are the Wagner Act in 1935, which is a huge victory for unions, right? Huge victory for unions. It upholds the right of unions to exist, first of all. It outlaws practices to suppress unions, which allows people who feel like if they're trying to form a union in a business and like the company's like firing people or like not giving people shifts or whatever because they're involved in trying to unionize people, that you could sue and not go to the federal government. You see that still today. One of the most common places where that happens is Walmart. You always hear all these kind of stories about Walmart employees trying to unionize, and then those people either get less shifts or they get fired outright. For some other, they're not saying you're trying to unionize, they're trying to fire you, or they're trying to disguise it, but there are tons of cases in which workers try to sue Walmart for firing them or treating them poorly or differently because they were trying to unionize. And it also created the National Labor Relations Board, which was an extension and a growth of what cousin Teddy Roosevelt created, which I can't remember exactly what it was called, the National Labor, I can't remember what it was called, but it was some organization that was specifically designed to promote the voice of unions in disputes between unions and business leaders. So the Wagner Act is all about making sure everybody knows unions have the right to exist. It is illegal to do anything to suppress the formation of unions, and we're elevating the union voice in the federal government in these negotiations. So this is about protecting workers. This is about making sure that workers aren't getting kind of trampled on during this time period. And it's, again, we're kind of beyond the relief, recovery, and reform stuff. That's more the first New Deal. But it is, if you're thinking about it from that context, this is more of a reform. This is just kind of confirming and strengthening unions and their position to make sure that they have a voice and they know that they're backed, and everybody knows that they're backed by the federal government. But then in 1935, the single most significant piece of legislation passed during the New Deal was passed. That's called the Social Security Act, which creates Social Security. This is basically what was being talked about here. Francis Townsend's old age revolving pension plan. FDR said, that's a good idea. I'm going to do that, but I'm going to call it Social Security. So Social Security is that people who are working, well, actually, I should go back a couple slides. It's kind of a combination of Francis Townsend's old age revolving pension plan and Father Coughlin's, not Father Coughlin, and Huey Long's Share Our Wealth Society. Because basically what Social Security does is every working person in America gets a certain percentage of their paycheck taken away from them. This is true today and has been true since the 1930s. So a certain percentage of your paycheck is taken by the federal government and it goes to the Social Security Fund. And then what they do is they take all the money in the Social Security Fund and then they send checks out to people who are retired. So right now, today, every check I get, a certain percentage of my money is taken by the federal government and it's sent out to your grandpa, my grandpa, somebody's grandpa, somebody's grandma, whatever. And that helps people who are retired to be able to get by. Some people don't get that great of a retirement, or some people don't get a retirement at all as far as having money after they're done working. So this is a way for people to be able to survive. So this is about helping people who are elderly, people who are retirement age, be able to economically survive. But it also includes unemployment compensation. It also includes payments of people who are widowed mothers and people who are disabled. So it's primarily about people who are retired and them getting that money after they have retired. That you've paid that money in theoretically, and then you get that money back when you get out. It doesn't exactly work that way, that the money that you put into it, you get out. The money that we're putting into it right now is going to people who are out. And then when we're all retired, people who are working, we will get the money that they do. But again, it also goes to unemployment compensation, which is going to be huge during the Great Depression when unemployment is so high. And then also for people who are disabled and can't work, and people who are basically like people who have kids who lose a spouse and they have a difficult time paying for it. So point being, it's taking a lot of those criticisms from the left or suggestions from the left of how you can do a better job and really putting them in practice. And again, the Social Security Act is, as I said, the biggest single piece of legislation because it's going to become a huge chunk of the federal government's spending every year from the 1930s all the way to 2021 and beyond. It is a huge part of the federal government, and it's one of the most popular pieces of federal of the federal government, one of the most popular federal programs that exists, because it's all about just making sure that people are taken care of who cannot take care of themselves, right? I think sometimes you can have a little bit of a disagreement when someone who's able-bodied and young doesn't work and then they get taken care of by the government, and there's like a reasonable argument about how much the government should help those people out. But if somebody's too old to work, if somebody's disabled, if somebody's trying to get a job but can't get a job, that's unemployment, like they're actively trying to get one but there's just not enough jobs out there for them to have. If someone has lost a spouse and can't cover the cost, like those are for the most part people who are beyond circumstances out of their control. They cannot cover the cost of living, and so the federal government will kind of cover that. This is a huge shift, right, in this big conversation of what's the role of the federal government. Like something like this would have been unimaginable under Harding, Coolidge, or Hoover, and really is well beyond anything that was done under even the progressive president. So it's a huge piece of legislation still today that is, every presidential election, Social Security will still come up as a topic of conversation, right? So it's huge, and again, it's a huge step towards the left. Also, during the second New Deal, we will pass yet another jobs program. This one is going to be called Works Progress America, I think, the WPA. So this is just like some of the other jobs programs we saw earlier with the Public Works Administration, et cetera, et cetera. Again, the government is doubling down on spending money on infrastructure. The WPA is going to build or repair over 650,000 miles of roads, over 120,000 bridges, over 125,000 public buildings, schools, post office, libraries, over 8,000 parks, and over 850 airports. and it's going to employ, most importantly, it's going to employ 8.5 million Americans. So again, these are people who are going to work, getting a check, getting money that they could spend, and that money is then getting pumped into the economy and getting us out. So, sorry, going back real quick. So, Social Security Act is absolutely a reform program. It's about thinking about the future. How can we protect people who are most kind of vulnerable to the impacts of the Great Depression? How can we protect those people in the future? That's a reform program. This is relief. And of course, as I said before, most relief programs are also recovery. So this is relief, getting people back to work who are unemployed, but also as they get back to work, as they spend that money, it brings the economy back. Okay, as I've mentioned a few times before, in 1936, FDR will run for re-election, and as you can see, he won by an even larger margin. His opponent only won 2 states. His opponent only won 8 electoral votes. FDR won a monumental election. This is the biggest electoral college victory in the history of the United States up until that point, or ever since. Nobody has ever won an electoral victory this wide, this large. And that tells you, again, the American people absolutely love what he's doing. They love the New Deal. They love him. They love the fireside chats. They feel like they know him. A lot of Americans have framed pictures of FDR in their home. People see him as an absolute hero of the American people. He's getting criticized from the right. He's getting criticized from the left. But a large swath of mainstream America absolutely adore and love FDR. Now, you can see, of course, there's criticism. King FDR is canceling the Constitution. And that's basically a criticism of the fact that they feel like some of the programs he's doing from the right, they're complaining, oh, this is socialism, this is tyranny, this is too much government spending. And again, I think there's a fair argument to be made about that, and it's interesting. But overall, my point, as I've made a number of times before, is in a time of great crisis, generally the American people give presidents a little bit more leeway to kind of go beyond the general bounds of the presidency. The question is always, once the crisis is over, are we going to be able to kind of pull that back? Like after the Civil War, we're able to kind of pull back the power of the presidency that was expanded during Lincoln, saying, I need to do this to win the Civil War. After the New Deal and the Great Depression's over, are we going to be able to pull back on the power of the presidency, which is going to be created by FDR, Franklin Roosevelt. But for now, people are all in. And as I said before, he's going to win in 1932, he's going to win in 1936. He's going to win in 1940. He's going to be the first president to run for a 3rd term and win. His cousin was the first one to run for a 3rd term, but he lost in 1912. So he's going to run for a 3rd term and win in 1940, and he's going to run for a 4th term and win in 1944. And each of those is going to be a landslide victory. So FDR is an absolute beloved president, right? Absolute beloved. That doesn't mean he's perfect. And when we get to World War II, we'll talk a little bit about some of his shortcomings, of course. But he by being active, by trying all of these things out, by trying to expand the federal government's role and trying to help people during economic crisis, he won clearly, as looking at that map, he won the large chunk of support and adoration from the American people. However, one of the big things that he tried and failed to do, as he was thinking about the biggest challenge to him being able to do even more, was the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court was kind of trying to, remember the Supreme Court overruled some of the programs. So he did attempt to do something that we call court packing, pack of the court. Basically what that means is you want to add 6 new justices at the Supreme Court. There's nothing in the Constitution that says how many judges are on the Supreme Court, how many justices are on the Supreme Court. So we just kind of got into this habit of having 9 justices, and that's what it was. So then FDR was like, well, why don't we add 6? And of course, the president is the one that gets to appoint them. And then the Congress is the one that gets to affirm, right? So FDR is like, let's add 6 more. He knows that his buddies in Congress will go along with it. He'll just be able to appoint 6 people that will agree with everything he wants to do, and they'll be able to override kind of the Supreme Court. This is the first thing that FDR does that a majority of the American people are like, I don't know, dude. And then when calls of him being a tyrant, of him being someone that kind of is going beyond the bounds of the Constitution, which technically is not beyond the bounds of the Constitution, but is someone who's very much trying to kind of grab on more power and exert his control over the government in a large way. So a lot of that criticism is going to begin to stick a little bit. Now, again, he's going to win every election he runs it by a large margin, but this is going to kind of tarnish his reputation to a certain degree, because people are going to see that he might be getting a little power hungry here. And maybe that's not necessarily something that a majority of the American people, as much as they like him, want to go along with. So that's going to be kind of one of the big black marks on his record. Part 4, we'll do very, very quickly. really quickly, we just want to look at how the New Deal impacts specific groups of people. So we know that organized labor, labor unions, the working class have a huge benefit from the New Deal, right? We know that the Wagner Act was a massive piece of legislation that's going to have a huge impact on organized labor. And this is basically going to create a forever relationship between organized labor and the Democratic Party. Like if you were to run for any office today in the United States as a Democrat, you would have the support of labor unions. That's just the way it goes. Labor unions support the Democrats, and it has been that way since the New Deal. So if we've kind of thinking about that, by and large, business kind of supports the Republican Party because the Republican Party is the pro-business party. So now we've kind of got to this place in American politics where businesses are associated with the Republican Party and working class is associated with the Democratic Party. So the wealthy are associated with the Republican Party and the working class people are associated with the Democratic Party. And that really is by and large a result of the Wagner Act and FDR's actions to really expand the government support as a Democrat, the government support for unions. So labor unions are more than thrilled, overwhelmed, super overjoyed with the New Deal. And again, it's going to create a forever relationship between the Democratic Party and labor unions. Women do not have any specific programs that positively impacted them. There's not really any specific government program that like the Women's National Back to Work, program or whatever. However, FDR's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, is going to kind of be the first lady that's going to kind of be actively involved in helping to form policy, and she's in the meetings and she has a voice and she goes around, she speaks to the American people, and she's very popular. She was more actually left and progressive than he was and pulled him leftward on a lot of these issues. He's also going to appoint Frances Perkins, who will be the Secretary of Labor, the very first female cabinet member our country will ever have. So symbolically, in a way of representation, having his wife be one of the faces of the administration, appointing women not only to cabinet positions but other high-ranking positions within this administration. This too is going to have FDR very popular among women, and have again, not a real, in a policy perspective, in a program perspective, positive impact on women from like, okay, we can see that more women got jobs as a result of this program and that program, but just in the sense of a huge shift in kind of the perception of women's role in government, of women's role at the federal level, and all that kind of stuff. So that's going to have a positive impact on women. African Americans, again, there's no real specific policies that are meant to help African Americans, and in fact, they're left out a bunch of the policies, like a lot of those like workers programs, like it's harder for them to get jobs there than it is for white people. However, African Americans feel very seen and supported by FDR. And some of the programs that are created benefit them just kind of peripherally, some of them don't, but there is no real specific focus. However, again, we will see Franklin Roosevelt appoint African Americans to offices. He sought advice from Black intellectuals about issues of civil rights and about how the programs may impact African Americans. So he was seen as a friend of the African American community. Now, this is a monumentally important piece because we know that African Americans are Republicans. It's the Republican Party that ended slavery. It's the Republican Party that did Reconstruction. African Americans are loyal Republicans. It's the Democratic Party, remember, that is the party of the Confederacy. The Democratic Party, that's the party of white supremacy in the South. So this is going to be the first Democratic president. And remember, Woodrow Wilson was a big supporter of the Ku Klux Klan, which is the most previous Democratic president. It's going to be the first Democratic president that is going to give voice to issues that impact African Americans. Although no specific policies, no specific huge achievements when it comes to civil rights, no New Deal programs that are meant to help Black people specifically. And in fact, Black people are left out of some of them, but still just the fact, similar to women, that there were high-ranking African Americans who were African Americans appointed to high-ranking positions. African American intellectuals were invited to the White House by the president to seek their advice and to seek their, feedback on a variety of things. This is going to have a huge impact on the African American community, who, by the way, has basically been forgotten by the Republican Party too. Neither of the parties at this point give any voice or any support to the African American community at all. Nobody has since 1877, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. But by and large, the African Americans have stuck with the Republicans because they were the party that that ended slavery. Well, now we're going to start to see an African American community. Again, no group of people vote in a monolith, but by and large, we'll see the African American community, African American voters shift from, we're going to see the beginning of the shift from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. FDR is going to create this very bizarre coalition where by the time he is done being president, the Democratic Party will both be the party of the white supremacist South and African American voters at the same time, which is going to be very bizarre and very weird, but more on that later on. Native Americans will have huge benefits from the New Deal. They created a new program for Native Americans. First of all, Native Americans were hit more than anybody then during the Great Depression. Their unemployment rate was 3 times the national average. But they created the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, which reversed the Dawes Act, which was from the 1890s, which you may recall was supposed to have a positive impact on Native Americans by helping them kind of resettle their lands, but ended up hurting them in the long run. And so this is an attempt to try to right that wrong and try to make things better for Native Americans. Not too much details on that, but just know that African Americans, Native Americans, labor, and women all felt as though, whether there were specific programs directed to them or not, felt as though FDR and the New Deal and FDR's presidency represented a kind of a positive turn, a positive direction in the nation for them. So we see a couple things happening to the Democratic Party under FDR. One, it's going to be associated with the working class and with labor. Two, it's going to be seen more and more as the party of kind of the general kind of people who have been generally kind of oppressed or voiceless in American history, right? More and more women voters are going to vote Democratic, more and more African American voters are going to vote Democratic, more and more working class people are going to vote Democratic, more and more Native Americans are going to vote Democratic. And so FDR kind of all by himself in his 14 years as president, which is a long time for someone to be president, his whole era, has kind of redesigned and rebuilt the Democratic Party in a completely different way. And we'll talk more about that later on. But the biggest piece of this lecture, of course, is the New Deal and those programs. All of the things they were trying to address, banking, agriculture and industrial jobs, not jobs, well, jobs again later, but agricultural and industrial kind of like production levels and stabilizing that, unemployment, housing, Wall Street, et cetera, et cetera. So knowing what those programs are and knowing which ones are relief, which ones are recovery, which ones are reform, and knowing that overall, the New Deal did not get us out of the Great Depression, but it helped us survive the Great Depression. If it had not been for the New Deal, the Great Depression may have been the thing that killed the United States. But it at least keeps us on life support, it keeps us going, keeps us moving forward. It does not end the Great Depression, but it does help us survive the Great Depression. And so understanding that it took an immense amount of government activity, an immense amount of government investment to make that happen. And that wasn't happening under Hoover. FDR came and he did it. It made him wildly popular. He did get some criticism, but overall, the programs were appreciated and supported by the American people, who they felt like they kind of had a supporter and a friend in FDR who was doing that work and trying to make the federal government work on behalf of the people to help them survive this thing. So that's a New Deal. All right. Thanks for listening. See you guys next time. Adios.